Hey everybody, this is Dawn with Painted Willow Art. This is today's paint along. We're going to do a nighttime forest, something along these lines. For this one we're going to use a few different supplies and different techniques than we've done in the last couple of videos. So for this one you're going to need two things of water. They don't have to be huge, just so you can have one clean and one dirty when we need it. For this painting, I'm using my Josie Lewis watercolor paint palette, and I'm using this one for a specific reason. For the background, that's a gradient from darker to lighter, this palette has multiple blues in it. I've got a nice light blue, and then I've got two darker blues and a purple. If you don't have a palette that has all of these in it, you could certainly mix your own colors. You can mix blues and reds to make purples. You can mix blues and blacks to get darker, blues and whites to get lighter. This one has them all in it, so for convenience sake, I'm going to use this one today. So I've got my watercolor palette that has three different colors of blue and a purple. So ultimately what's going to happen is the lightest blue is going to be at the bottom, the darkest blue at the top, and it's going to be a gradient down to purple and lighter blues all the way down. For this, I've got three different brushes. This one is a number 12, I think it's Princeton. I don't know that the brand necessarily matters. Let me move this so you can see the size. This is a number 12. It's a fairly big brush. Because we're going to be covering a lot of area with paint and water, a bigger brush is nicer for that. I've got my number 8 that I always use. For some reason, I default back to this brush. I'm going to use this for the trees. Now, depending on the size of paper you use, a smaller brush for the trees might be good. So this one's a number 6. I've got it here just in case, because I'm actually going to paint on a smaller paper than I did for the sample. So I'm going to start with my 8. If that's too big, I'm going to go to my 6. And then I've got just another brush. The size really doesn't make any difference on this one. This is just a random brush that I had. What you're looking for, though, is a flatter surface. We're going to use this to splatter the stars. Okay? So I've got a couple of different watercolor brushes, a random wider brush. I'm going to use white acrylic paint for the stars instead of watercolor. White watercolor, because watercolor is transparent and you can, or semi-transparent in some cases, and you can see through to the layers beneath. If you try to use white watercolor for this, often your stars look a little bit washed out, and I want them to be really bright and vibrant, so I'm going to use an acrylic paint. This one is golden. It's just the one I happened to grab. It really doesn't make any difference, the brand, as long as it's a white acrylic paint. So we'll use that for the stars. I've got a little plate to water down my white with when the time comes. And for this one, I'm actually going to tape the paper down, and I haven't done that on the last couple of videos because they've been fairly quick paintings and we haven't used a ton of water. This one's going to use a whole lot more water to get the gradient. So what I've got is a piece of 140-pound Strathmore 400 watercolor paper. You can use any watercolor paper you have. However, the higher the pound rating, the better it's going to stand up to water. We're going to get warping with this. Now, I'm just going to tape it down. I'm not going to pre-stretch the paper. There are some benefits to pre-stretching the paper, and you can Google stretching watercolor paper, and there's all kinds of explanations of that. Because this is just going to be a quick little painting and not something that I'm going to spend days and days working on, I'm really not going to worry about stretching it first. So I'm just going to tape it down because it is going to bubble and warp, and the tape will help prevent a little bit of that. With as much water as we're going to use on this, you're not going to avoid buckling and warping completely. So I'm going to tape this down to start. I'm just taping it down to an old canvas panel that I had. You can use a glass cutting board. You can use a sheet of plexiglass, anything that's got a solid surface that you can tape this to. Washi tape works really well for taping these down because it doesn't stick to the paper very much. So when you pull it off, you don't end up with something like this right here. I am out of washi tape, however, so I'm going to use masking tape for mine. And I'm going to pick the camera up and move you for just a second, so hopefully this doesn't make anybody dizzy. Masking tape can be really, really sticky. So if I'm going to use masking tape, I like to stick it to my pants first. So you can see I've got masking tape stuck to my leg. What that does is put just a little bit of fuzz on the tape. So the tape is still sticky, but it's not so sticky that it's going to rip my paper. And I usually find that doing that before I tape these down, if I'm using masking tape, really helps prevent that peeling off of the paint thing that's going on there. So to do this, I am just going to give myself a little bit of a border on the paper. And you can see here, there's just like, I don't know, maybe 1/4 of an inch that I've done there. And I'm going to tape this down to the board. I'm going to do all 4 sides because I want this thing to stay put. Give it a good press so you can make sure that it's stuck really, really well. I don't know if you can see on camera, there's kind of some color on the, looks like shaded areas on the back of my tape. That's where the fuzz from my pants is. But that's a good thing because that's going to prevent it from destroying my paper when I rip it off. So there we go. With that set, I'm going to give you my disclaimer now. And my disclaimer is that I am not the best at the gradients. I really like kind of the blotchy watercolor look, and that's how I tend to paint. So I don't do gradients a lot. So it's not something I've perfected, but practice makes perfect. So I'm going to show you how I do it anyway. There, I'm sure, are different schools of thought to this. You could Google watercolor gradients and see lots of different tutorials on how to do this, but I'm going to show you how I do it. Certainly it will be practice for me and something that you can play around with as well. So to get this started, I am going to get my paper wet to start with. So I'm just dipping my brush in plain water and putting a coat of water on the paper. It doesn't need to be super, super soaked. I don't know if I can get this in the light so you can see it. There's just kind of a little sheen on the paper. It's not drenched, but it looks a little shiny and slick. So that's what we want. What that's going to do is give us a good surface for the water to bleed, or for the paint to bleed as we're painting, and that's what we're going for. So to start this, I'm going to go into my lightest blue first. And again, I'm kind of lazy, so I just go directly into the pan rather than diluting it first. And I'm going to start about halfway here on the paper. And I'm just going to drag it down. And you'll notice that it's darker up here at the top and lighter down here at the bottom. That's what I'm going for. And then I'm going to come back and grab one of my darker blues and do the same thing, only I'm going to start on the top half up here. And I do have my paper turned sideways. I've been showing you the sample this way. I'm starting with my paper this way, and it's just because it's easier for me to do the gradient working across than it is working down, and it's just, that's the way my hands move the best. So I will turn this eventually before we do the trees. So I'm just going with a little bit of a darker blue, putting it up here at the top, drag it down, and when I get to the lighter blue, I'm just going to continue all the way down. So I'm dragging these two together and kind of blending them here in the middle. You can see how they're starting to blend together. I don't mind that there are little ridges here and there. Some people like to have a really perfect gradient. I mentioned I'm a fan of kind of the splotchy watercolor look. So I don't necessarily mind if there's a few lines here and there. That is fine by me. And I just put a little splop of water on there that's going to make a funny mark. So I'm just going to run that back and forth. Okay. At this point, I will dry my painting. Keep in mind that watercolor is going to dry lighter than it looks on the page. And you'll notice the one we're working on looks drastically lighter than the sample anyway. It's going to take a couple of coats to get this dark enough to look like this. So at this point, I'm going to hit this with my blow dryer. So I'm going to pause you for a second and speed up the video while I blow dry it, just so you can see what happens. Hold on a second. Okay, that's dry. And you can see that it's a lot lighter than it looked like when it was wet. So that's our first coat. We're going to do a couple of more coats of this, going gradually darker and darker and darker. So what I'm going to do is come back in and get a little bit of my light blue again and start down here at the bottom and kind of move it up. And I'm going to clean my brush off, and I've got a purple. So I'm going to come in and put some purple right here in the middle. And I kind of want that to blend, so I'm just going to drag them back and forth over each other a little bit, get them to blend together. And then I'm going to go with a darker blue at the very top. And I'm picking up a pretty good amount of paint on my brush, so I'm dropping a good bit of paint on here. So there's my darker blue. I'm going to clean my brush off, and I'm going to come back with just some plain water on my brush just to allow the paints to move a little bit. And I'm just going to start at the top and drag my way down. And all that's doing is pulling the wet paint into each other. Because these colors essentially go together, blues will blend without creating mud. I'm just dragging one down over the top of the other. So that's coat 2. Again, I'm going to pause you for a second and speed up the video while I dry it. So at this point, go hit yours with the blow dryer again. Okay, there's coat 2. You can see it's getting a little darker. You may notice as you're doing this too that when you're getting the water on your paper and the paint, your paper's kind of bubbling up a little bit and it's starting to warp. And as you hit it with the blow dryer and it dries, it settles back down. That's what it's going to do. Every time you put a coat on it, it's going to kind of bubble up and warp. And then as you dry it, it's going to set back down. Ultimately, you can see on my sample, hopefully, the paper's a little bit warped, which is fine. That's just what watercolor does. There are ways you can flatten these out, and maybe I'll show you that in another video. But for today, we're just going to worry about getting the painting done. So you can see with that second coat, it's a little bit darker now. So I'm going to do it again, only this time, I'm just going to use my dark blue. I'm going to let it kind of come down over the tops of these others and blend a little bit more. So I'm getting a good bit of paint from my palette. You can see that's a pretty good splop of paint, pretty dark. And I'm going to clean my brush off a little bit, just get some water on it, and run down with just the water. And as it starts to get kind of fuzzy down there, put some more water on your brush and go back over that. Just re-wet it a little bit and drag it back down. Okay. We're going to dry this again. So I'm not going to show you the drying this time because you've seen that, so I'm just going to pause it for a second and dry it. You do the same thing. Pause here for a second, hit yours with your blow dryer. And just real quick, I don't know if you can see it on camera, I got a little splop of water right here and it's kind of making a little like cauliflower shape in there. I'm just going to come back over this with the brush and smooth it out a little bit. Okay, so pause here, blow dry it again. Okay, I'm back. That coat is dry. And you can see I've kind of got a little bit of splotchiness going on in here. I'm okay with that. To me, that almost makes it look, when you look at it the way it's going to be, it almost makes it look like cloud lines or something like that in there. And I kind of like that, so I'm not going to worry about trying to smooth those out anymore. If I wanted to smooth those out, I could come back with a little bit of water and just kind of back and forth across them to blend them a little bit better, or I can blend a little better with the next coat, but that doesn't bother me, so I'm going to leave it like that. I'm going to do one more coat with my darkest blue. So again, I'm going to pick up a good bit of paint, and I'm just kind of splopping it on here for a minute to get the paint on the paper, and then I'm just going to drag it back and forth like I have been. So with each coat, that top part gets a little darker, Clean off my brush and come back with just plain water. And I'm just dragging it down, I think I'm going to put a little bit more paint on there still, just so we get that sky nice and dark. And you can see that because this paint is semi-transparent, even though I've got the darker blue up here, you can still see some of the purple behind. And then it fades to the lighter blue. So that gives me my gradient there. I'm gonna dry this one more time. So pause here, hit yours with the dryer if you're painting along, and I'll be right back. Okay, we're back. Did you notice that my blow dryer says Black & Decker on it? That's because it's a heat gun. I've got a heat gun out in the studio that I use because I use it for different things, so it's kind of a multi-purpose tool. But when I'm painting in the house, I use my blow dryer, and either works just fine. So at this point, we've got us a pretty good gradient going. This is where you get to decide if you want your sky darker or not. I'm good with where this is now. If you do want your sky a little bit darker, you can certainly do another coat, and just keep going layer on layer on layer until you get the sky as dark as you want it. Okay, but I'm going to call it good with this for right now. The next thing we're going to do is put our stars on. So you can see on the sample we've got some stars up here. So to do that, I am going to put just a little splop of my white acrylic paint on a plate or in a cup or whatever you've got to blend it with. And then I'm going to take that flatter brush that I had. To this point, I've just been using one jar of water. So all of my blues have been going in there. And that second one I mentioned is clean. I'm going to use the clean one to blend my white with, because if I use the blue, I'm going to get a blue tinge to this, and I want my stars to be really vibrant white. So all I'm doing is just getting my brush wet and mixing that paint with some water, and I want it good and runny, like ink consistency. So I'm just putting some water in there, scrubbing my brush around, and getting that good and liquidy and inky. And when you've got your paint pretty inky, you can just run your paintbrush through there, get it loaded up nice and thick. And then I'm going to try and put my stars just kind of on this top half. I don't really need to get any down here because we're going to put the trees down here. So the trees would be blocking them anyway. So I'm kind of going for like this top half to top third. So the easiest way for me to do this is just kind of hold my finger here and tap my brush against my finger. And you can see that just makes splatters. And you're just going to do that until you have the number of stars that you want. The harder you tap on your finger, the bigger the splatters are going to be. The lighter you tap, you get these little tiny splatters. Okay? So there's that. And I just made a mess over here with the white paint. That's okay. So at this point, I'm going to hit this again with my blow dryer. These might not dry completely very quickly, but I'm going to do it anyway just to get them started. If they don't dry completely, that's okay. We'll let them finish drying on their own, but at least it gets them started. So hit pause here, go hit this with the blow dryer again, get those stars started drying. So I'll be right back. Okay, there we go. We've got us some cool stars in our background for our night sky. The next thing is the trees, and I'm going to set this aside for a second. If you have a scrap piece of watercolor paper, grab it for a minute, because it might be easier if you've never done trees like this to practice on a scrap piece of paper before you do it on your good painting, just to get the feel of what we're doing. So the way we're going to make these trees, on my palette, this didn't have any black, but I do have a tube of black, so I just put a little bit of black paint here that I'm going to use to make my trees. If you don't have any black paint, you can certainly mix dark blues, dark purples, dark reds to get kind of a blackish, bluish, purpley mix, but just a paint that's really, really dark, and that would work just fine too, okay? So if you don't have black, you can improvise with mixing darker colors to make something close to black. I've actually seen people do these monochromatically, meaning they're all one color, like all purple. And so their background gradient would go from a dark purple to a light purple. And then they would use a dark purple, dark blue combination to do their trees. And those are really cool too. So don't panic if you don't have black. There are options to that. You can just mix other colors to make a dark concoction. So with this black, I'm just adding some water to it. getting the paint loosened up from the dry paint so that I can load my brush pretty good. And by getting that brush good and wet and loaded with the paint, hopefully you can see it, that chisel tip on the watercolor brush is nice and sharp, and that's what I want. So to do these trees, they're really pretty basic. Make sure I got this at the right angle. I'm going to start at what I think the top of my tree should be. So I'm just arbitrarily deciding how tall my trees are going to be. And at that top, I'm just going to drag down lightly with that chisel tip and then just kind of start pressing back and forth. As your paint starts to get lighter, load some more paint on your brush and just continue that, pressing back and forth. And you're going to get a little wider as you go down. And you're going to get a little denser as you go down. We're not going to have as many spaces in the tree down here as we do up top, because the idea is in a forest, you know, those trees are all kind of growing close together, and so it gets denser as you get to the bottom. And then I'm going to do the same thing. I'm just going to come next to it and start another tree. And that one I got too close together. I'm doing it. I need to do it sideways because that's the angle I paint at. So just start dragging it down and then tap back and forth, leaving you some space in there, going wider as you go down. If you feel like the brush you have is too thick, too fat, go to a smaller brush and do the same thing. And that's why doing it on a scrap piece of paper is good first, because you can kind of play around with it a little bit and see with a smaller brush what that does for you. If you like that smaller brush better, then by all means use that one. Okay, and we're going to do each tree the same way. You're going to vary the heights of the trees. So some of them you're going to start up taller, some of them you're going to start down lower, and all of them as you get down towards the bottom, you're just going to, you know, kind of black them in so that ultimately when we get to the bottom, they kind of all run together like this. Now you'll notice on this one there's some light spots and some dark spots. That's just the natural blotchiness of the watercolor paint, and I've left it that way because to me that gives it a little bit of dimension. The trees aren't going to be uniformly colored across all of them. You're going to have darker trees and lighter trees depending on how the light hits them, how close together they are. So I don't mind, you know, that kind of blotchy look there. So I'm going to leave it that way, and that's the way I'm going to do it on this one. So hopefully you got the idea on the trees there. If you want to practice a little bit before you do it on your main painting, that's perfectly fine. Just on a scratch piece of paper, practice your trees. So you're just going to lightly pull that chisel tip down to make the top, and then just start pouncing back and forth, leaving some spaces here and there. You can give it a little drag now and then if you want to give the tree a little bit of different dimension. And then it just gets fuller and darker as you go down. Okay, this top part is where we're getting the definition of the tree. So if you want to practice those a little bit before you do it on your main drawing. I'm going to pull this guy back over here, and I'm going to do mine at an angle. Like I said, I just work better at an angle. If you do too, go ahead and angle your painting. Put it at whatever angle works the best for you. This piece of paper is a little bit bigger than my scratch piece of paper that I was practicing my trees on was, so I'm going to go back to my bigger brush for this. Again, you're going to use a brush that's sized for the paper you're using, and I'm painting on a 5x7 piece today. This one was a 6x9. You can see it's a little bit bigger. So you're just going to size your brush to the page that you're using, and there's not a rule about that necessarily, but that's where sometimes having a little scratch piece of paper to play around with a little bit before you do it on your main painting is nice, because you can get a feel for which brush is going to work the best size-wise for this. So I'm going to put my paint over here because, knowing me, I will drip black paint across this somewhere and then I have a mess. So I'm just loading up my brush with watered down black paint, and I'm going to just arbitrarily decide where my tree is going to start. So I'm going to start one right here, pull that chisel tip down, and then just kind of dab back and forth to create the definition of my tree. And I'm getting thicker as I go down. And then for this bottom part, I'm just coming in here and smacking some paint down. I'm not really being too terribly careful with this. And once I get all the trees in, I'm going to come back and go over that part anyway. You can always vary your brushes. If you want to use both brushes, this brush and a smaller brush to do your trees, certainly absolutely do that. I'm going to put a bigger tree over here. And just remember to get wider and wider as you go down. Make sure you got a good amount of paint in your brush so that you get that nice dark color. And again, at the bottom, I'm just kind of splopping it in. There are people who do this a whole lot better than I do. Their trees are much more defined, much nicer. It just takes a little bit of practice. This is not the type of watercolor painting I typically do. But I wanted to show you an option. We've done everything pretty whimsical so far, and I just wanted to show you an option, some things you can do. You can always come back and just kind of dab your brush here and there to make your trees look kind of fuzzy and fluffy like a pine tree does if you want to. Certainly that's an option. Give it some, looks like it's got some needles going on. I am going to switch over and use my smaller brush for just a minute and make a tree that's a little bit smaller. So I'm going to load that one up and put a little bit of a smaller tree in here. And I think on this smaller tree, I'm not going to go down any further just yet because I'm going to come back and add some more black in here. So I'll get across there with more black when I come back in a minute. And I'm going to put another smaller tree over here. And you're just kind of playing with the shape of the tree as you go too. If you don't like the top of it, you can always make it a little taller and kind of go back and give it a little bit of a start over. So with those in there, I'm going to go back to my bigger brush, and I'm just going to start splopping in some black paint in here. Now, because even the black can be semi-transparent depending on how much you've got, you might have spots where your light blue down here at the bottom is showing through. And that's perfectly fine. Like I said, I'm just kind of splopping the paint in so that I've got different shades of the paint. I've got some dark spots, I've got some light spots. I like that blotchiness with watercolor. And there we go. So I'm going to hit this again with my blow dryer. So I'm going to pause you for just a second. You can do the same thing, blow dry yours if you want. Okay, I hit that with the blow dryer, and I don't know if you can tell on camera if it's picking it up, but it dried a lot lighter than what I had there when it was wet, like watercolor does. So if you get yours dry and it doesn't look like the black is as dark as you want it, do another coat over it. Load up your brush again, and you don't have to get exactly every spot you did last time. That gives it some dimension by having some of those light spots and dark spots. But just go back in and blot your paint over the top of where you were before. That will give you another layer that will inherently make it darker. Okay, there you go. So I'm going to pause it again, dry it real quick. Hold on. Okay, it's not completely dry, but it's close. And that is where I would call it done for this one. Now, options. You can put those trees in, and when they dry really light, like mine did the first time, if you wanted to, instead of going back over those same trees, you could come off to the side a little bit of each of them and put another tree in darker, so that what you end up with is a lighter gray layer of trees in the back and a darker layer of trees in the front. Makes it look like a more dimensional forest. That is certainly an option. Like I said, this is not the type of watercolor painting I usually do, so I'm not the best at this, but I did want to show you that even with some basic watercolor skills, you can still create something that looks pretty cool in a fairly short amount of time. And if this is the type of watercolor painting that interests you, there are tons of tutorials on YouTube by other people who do this particular technique better than I do. The fun part of these when you get them done is pulling the tape off, because by putting that tape on there, you also create yourself a little bit of a border, which is nice. It gives it kind of a little bit of a finished look. I like to pull my tape off at a 45-degree angle. That helps to minimize, if your tape is really sticky, it helps to minimize this issue where it pulls part of the paper off. There we go. With that, you have a finished painting fairly quickly. And these, these are fun to do like on the fronts of greeting cards or things like that, or do this painting and write a little note on the back of it to send as a card to a friend, or I just hang up in your house. They're cool looking. So there you go. There's a quick, easy nighttime forest. If you have questions on it, please feel free to comment or email me. I'm happy to answer questions if I can. And if you have suggestions for things you'd like to see for a paint along, absolutely shoot me those. I'm always looking for ideas. If there's something in particular you all would like to see, I am happy to show you what I can about it. And if you're enjoying these videos, please either give them a comment or a thumbs up, so I know. I can see how many people are watching them, but it helps me if you're enjoying them to give it a thumbs up, so I know whether this is something to keep doing if people are enjoying it. Okay? So with that, happy painting, and I will have another paint along for you next week. Thanks, everybody.